My aunt slammed her hand on the polished wooden table in the courtroom and announced to everyone sitting there, "She owes me $50,000 for raising her." The room went quiet, every head turning toward me, as if waiting to see if I'd crumble under her words. My throat tightened, but I kept my chin high, refusing to let her see me flinch. What she didn't expect was that I had spent years preparing for this very moment, documenting every ugly detail, every manipulation, every twisted story she had crafted to paint herself as my savior. The truth was, my aunt hadn't raised me out of kindness or love. She had used me as a bargaining chip, a personal maid, and a financial safety net she thought she could cash in whenever it suited her. As the judge looked over his glasses at her, I could see the irritation flicker across his face. He wasn't buying it. He asked her calmly to explain how, exactly, she came up with such a number. That's when she began to stumble, her carefully rehearsed script unraveling under the weight of scrutiny. And as I sat there, heart pounding but face calm, I realized that this was no longer just about money. This was about finally exposing the truth of what my childhood had really been like, and watching her empire of lies collapse in front of everyone. I grew up in my aunt's house, but it was never really a home. From the outside, people thought she was a saint for taking me in after my parents passed. But behind closed doors, it was a different story. I wasn't treated like family. I was treated like staff. While her kids slept in decorated bedrooms with posters and fairy lights, I was given a cot in the basement right next to the washer and dryer, where the hum of machines became my lullaby. Every morning before school, I was expected to make breakfast for everyone, pack lunches for her children, and sweep the kitchen before I even touched my own homework. If I dared to complain, she would say, "You should be grateful I even put a roof over your head." At 12 years old, I was scrubbing her floors, folding laundry that wasn't mine, and babysitting her toddlers for hours so she could run off to bingo or her endless shopping trips. She'd return with shopping bags filled with new clothes and shoes for her kids, while I wore the same threadbare jeans year after year. And yet, to outsiders, she would brag about how she was raising me as her own, how much of a burden I was, and how much money it supposedly cost her to keep me around. I carried that narrative for years, ashamed and believing I was a debt she had to pay. But as I grew older, I realized the truth. She had never raised me. She had exploited me. She wasn't supporting me. She was profiting off me. Keeping the monthly checks from the state meant for my welfare, money I never saw a dime of. By the time I turned 18, she had convinced me I should feel indebted to her forever. So when she looked me dead in the eye in that courtroom and demanded $50,000, I felt a strange calm, because finally, I wasn't the scared little girl in the basement anymore. I had my own evidence, my own voice, and a judge who was about to hear everything she had buried. Under years of manipulation, when I moved out at 18, I thought I was finally free of her. I got my first job at a bookstore, a tiny apartment with peeling paint, but it was mine. And for the first time, I could breathe without hearing her voice barking orders at me. She rarely called unless she wanted something, usually money. It started small. "Can you cover the electric bill this month?" Or, "I need you to lend me a few hundred for groceries. You owe me anyway." She'd guilt me with that same line, "You owe me for raising you." At first, I caved. I'd send what I could, feeling the weight of that imaginary debt pressing down on me. But over time, I noticed her requests grew bolder. Suddenly, she was asking for thousands, claiming she had spent at least 50 grand feeding and clothing me. She even threatened to drag me to court, convinced a judge would side with her because family obligations apparently counted as contracts in her twisted mind. I started saving every text, every voicemail, every passive-aggressive message where she claimed she'd wasted her life on me. I wasn't preparing to fight her, at least not yet. I was simply trying to keep records, because deep down, I knew the day would come when she would push too far. That day arrived when I was 24. I received an official letter. She had actually filed a claim in small claims court, demanding $50,000 in back compensation for raising me. My hands shook as I read it, but not out of fear. This was my chance. Finally, I could put everything on record. The lies, the exploitation, the money she pocketed that was meant for me. All of it. I called a lawyer the very same day. The weeks leading up to the hearing were some of the hardest of my life. My aunt paraded around town, telling anyone who would listen that she was about to finally get what she deserved. From me. That ungrateful brat she claimed had ruined her life. I ran into neighbors who looked at me with pity, some even whispering that maybe I should just give her the money to keep the peace. They had no idea that during those same years, she supposedly sacrificed everything for me. She had also been collecting survivors' benefits every single month after my parents died. Money meant to feed, clothe, and shelter me. Money that had instead paid for her salon visits, her cruises, her kids' brand new electronics. I dug through old records, and with my lawyer's help, we uncovered the trail. Over $1,200 a month for nearly a decade, funneled straight into her account. That alone totaled more than what she was now demanding. The hypocrisy was staggering. When the day of court finally arrived, I walked in shaking, but I wasn't alone. I had binders full of documents, receipts, and bank statements. My aunt strutted in with nothing but a smug smile and the confidence of someone who thought manipulation worked on judges the same way it worked on children. She sat across from me, arms crossed, her lawyer looking equally unprepared. I remember the way she smirked when the judge asked her to present her claim. She spoke with fake sadness in her voice, saying she had poured her heart, soul, and money into me, only to be abandoned. Then it was my turn. My lawyer slid the first binder forward. Page after page revealed the deposits she had received, the checks she cashed, the vacations she booked, all while telling me there wasn't enough money for new shoes. I watched the color drain from her face as the judge flipped through the evidence. For the first time in my life, the balance of power shifted, and she knew it. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable as he turned page after page. My aunt fidgeted, tugging at the sleeves of her jacket, trying to keep her composure. When he finally looked up, his voice was steady but sharp. He asked her to clarify why she believed I owed her $50,000 when, by all available records, she had already received more than that amount in government support intended for me. She stammered, saying the money wasn't enough, that she had to sacrifice her time, her peace, her freedom. But the judge didn't let her hide behind vague words. He pressed her for specifics. Receipts for food, clothing, schooling, anything that proved she had spent her own money on me. She had nothing. Her attorney looked increasingly nervous, rifling through an empty folder, as if he could magically conjure documents out of thin air. My lawyer, calm and methodical, pointed out how my grades dropped when I was living in the basement, how I missed school events because she kept me home to babysit, how I had medical bills from untreated injuries that went unpaid. He even had statements from a few teachers who remembered me coming to class hungry or wearing the same worn-out clothes for weeks. Every piece painted a clearer picture. She hadn't raised me, she had exploited me and pocketed the funds. The room was silent, except for the sound of papers being shuffled. Then the judge sighed and said something I'll never forget. This isn't a case of compensation. This is a case of mismanagement. And frankly, I find your claim outrageous. My aunt's jaw dropped, and for once, she didn't have a rehearsed line ready. Her silence filled the courtroom louder than any words could. She tried to recover, blurting out that I was lying, that I had twisted everything to make her look bad. But the judge wasn't moved. He raised an eyebrow and asked her why. If she had truly given up so much for me, there wasn't a single record of her expenses. Surely, he said, a person who spends $50,000 could show at least some proof of those costs. Her lawyer tried to object, muttering about oral agreements and family obligations. But the judge cut him off firmly. The court deals in evidence, not sentiment. My heart pounded as my lawyer produced the final blow. Documents showing that not only had my aunt received survivor's benefits, but she had also filed for tax deductions every year, claiming me as a dependent, all while telling me I was a financial burden. The hypocrisy couldn't have been clearer. For a moment, the courtroom was frozen. Then the judge turned to me and said, "You don't owe her anything. In fact, if I were you, I'd consider whether restitution should be sought the other way around." My aunt's mouth opened, then closed again, like she was gasping for air. She tried to shout, but her lawyer placed a hand on her arm, clearly realizing the fight was over. I sat there, calm but trembling inside, realizing that after years of being silenced, someone with authority had finally seen the truth. It wasn't just about winning a case. It was about reclaiming my life from the person who had stolen my childhood and tried to steal my future. When we walked out of that courtroom, I expected her to storm off, but instead, she spun around and hissed at me in the hallway, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you've won? You think anyone's going to believe you over me? You are nothing without me." I just looked at her, really looked, and for the first time saw her clearly. Not as the towering figure who controlled my every move growing up, but as a bitter woman whose lies had finally caught up with her. People passing by stopped to stare at the scene. Her face was red, her hands shaking, but I didn't raise my voice. I simply said, "You didn't raise me, you used me, and now everyone knows it." The silence that followed was heavier than her shouting ever could have been. In the weeks that followed, word spread quickly through our town. Those same neighbors who once whispered that I should just pay her now avoided her entirely. She lost her standing in her church, the community groups where she boasted about her sacrifices. Even her closest friends began to distance themselves. I didn't rub it in. I didn't gloat. I let the truth speak for itself. But she couldn't let it go. She tried calling me, leaving endless voicemails about how I had ruined her reputation and destroyed the family. Each one was more desperate than the last. But I never answered. I had blocked her number months before and only checked the messages when I felt strong enough to stomach them. Eventually they stopped. She must have realized she had no power left over me. And in that silence, I finally felt something I'd been waiting for my entire life. Peace. I could go to work without fearing she'd show up demanding money. I could walk through my neighborhood without hearing her name dragged into every conversation. I wasn't her project, her scapegoat, or her unpaid labor anymore. I was free. Not long after, I started to rebuild my life on my own terms. I poured my energy into finishing my degree, working double shifts to cover tuition and rent, but every hour felt lighter without her shadow hanging over me. For the first time, I wasn't working to pay off a guilt I never owed. I was working for myself. Still, her presence lingered in unexpected ways. At family gatherings, distant relatives would corner me with questions, half believing her version of events. "Couldn't you just forgive her?" they'd ask, as if forgiveness meant ignoring years of stolen childhood and stolen money. I learned quickly that standing up for myself didn't just mean facing her in court. It meant holding my ground against anyone who tried to minimize what she'd done. My lawyer encouraged me to consider filing a counterclaim for restitution, since technically, the survivor's benefits were mine, not hers. I thought about it for weeks. Part of me wanted to go after every cent, to finally make her feel the consequences of what she had stolen. But another part of me knew that the sweetest revenge wasn't dragging her back into court. It was moving so far beyond her reach that she couldn't touch me again. I decided not to pursue the money. I let it go, not for her, but for me, because every minute I spent thinking about her was a minute she still controlled. I wanted my freedom more than I wanted her dollars. That didn't mean she got off easy. People whispered about her everywhere she went. Her reputation in shreds. Her children quietly embarrassed by her behavior. And though she tried to claw her way back into respectability, every door seemed to close on her. That was justice enough for me. Years later, when I had built a stable life of my own, I ran into one of her children at the grocery store. Her daughter, now grown with kids of her own, hesitated before approaching me. I braced myself for hostility, expecting her to defend her mother. But instead, she whispered, almost ashamed, "I'm sorry for how she treated you. We saw more than you think." My chest tightened because for so long I believed no one noticed that I had suffered invisibly. But she went on to explain that they too had lived under their mother's manipulations, though in different ways. Pressured to keep silent, guilted into taking her side, punished if they questioned her narrative. She told me her mom still complained about me, still insisted I owed her, but fewer and fewer people were listening. Hearing that didn't sting the way I thought it would. Instead, it confirmed something I had come to accept. My aunt would never change, never admit fault, never apologize. And I didn't need her to. I had survived her. I had outgrown her. The judge's words still echoed in my mind whenever doubt crept in. "You don't owe her anything." They became a mantra, a shield, a reminder that I wasn't defined by her bitterness or her lies. I left the store that day with my head high, groceries in hand, and a sense of closure I hadn't realized I was still chasing. Because for the first time, I wasn't looking over my shoulder waiting for her next attack. I was simply living, and that was the kind of victory she could never take away from me. She still tried, of course. A year after the trial, I received a letter in the mail, written in her dramatic, looping handwriting. It wasn't an apology. It was a demand masked as sentiment. She claimed she was sick, that her medical bills were piling up, and that as the person she raised like a daughter, it was my duty to step in and pay. My hands shook as I read it, but not from fear this time, from anger. Anger that even now, after everything, she still believed she had the right to drain me dry. I didn't respond. Instead, I kept the letter and added it to the thick folder of evidence I'd built over the years. That way, if she ever tried to drag me back into court or spread new lies, I'd be ready. And then I shredded the copy she mailed, because I refused to let her words live in my home. She sent 2 more letters over the next few months, each more desperate, each blaming me for her declining health, for her loneliness, for the crumbling of her reputation. When those didn't work, she showed up outside my workplace one afternoon, shouting that I had ruined her life. My co-workers pulled me inside while security escorted her off the property. That was the last time she tried face-to-face. After that, she became a ghost. Someone I only heard about secondhand. A relative would mention she had moved to a smaller house, that she rarely went out in public anymore, that she was increasingly isolated. And while a small part of me pitied her, the larger part of me felt relief. Because she had built her life on control, manipulation, and lies. And when those collapsed, she had nothing left. I, on the other hand, was finally free to build a life rooted in truth, independence, and dignity. A few months after that last encounter, I received another call from a distant cousin who sounded almost nervous to bring up my aunt's name. She told me that my aunt had been going around claiming I had bankrupted her, and that I was the reason she had lost her car and was being forced to downsize. I listened quietly, and when she paused, I asked just one question. Did she mention the money she stole from me for a decade? There was silence on the other end, then a sigh. My cousin admitted that more and more people were starting to realize the truth. That my aunt's story had holes, that her bitterness didn't add up, that she had always lived beyond her means while crying poverty. And I realized then that I didn't have to defend myself anymore. The evidence was already out there. Her mask had already slipped, and her own actions were destroying her credibility better than anything I could say. I started to notice the shift in my own life too. For years, I had carried the weight of proving I wasn't what she claimed, that I wasn't ungrateful or indebted, but slowly that weight lifted. I no longer felt the need to justify my choices or explain my past. I could focus on work, on friendships, on building a home that felt warm and safe. something I had never known as a child. And though the scars of my upbringing were still there, they became reminders of what I had overcome, not chains holding me down. By the time I turned 30, I realized that the most powerful form of revenge wasn't the courtroom victory, or the silence I left her with. It was living fully, without her shadow looming over me. She had wanted me to live my whole life in debt, but instead, I was living in freedom. One of the most striking moments came when I was invited to speak at a local community event about resilience and overcoming hardship. I stood in front of a room filled with people, some of whom had known my aunt for years, and shared pieces of my story. Not to humiliate her, but to show others that survival doesn't always look like perfection. It looks like getting up from a cot in a cold basement and still making it to school. It looks like saving texts, letters, and bank statements, because one day the truth will matter. And it looks like standing in court, facing down the person who swore you'd never escape them, and walking away stronger. As I spoke, I saw faces soften, nods of understanding, even tears. People who had once whispered doubt now looked at me with respect. It hit me then. She had always tried to steal my voice, but now it was louder than hers could ever be. Afterward, a woman came up to me, clutching my hand, and told me she had grown up in a similar situation with a controlling relative. She said hearing my story gave her hope to finally set boundaries. That moment stayed with me because it reminded me that my aunt's attempts to break me had failed spectacularly. Instead, she had unintentionally shaped me into someone stronger, someone who could help others see the way out of their own cages. My aunt faded into obscurity after that. Occasionally, I'd hear rumors that she argued with store clerks, that she tried to guilt her children for money, that she was seen wandering town, looking worn and bitter. But I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt distance, like watching a storm pass miles away, no longer close enough to harm me. By the time the years rolled forward, the courtroom scene had become a memory I carried like a badge of survival, not a wound. I had built a career, carved out friendships that felt like family, and even started therapy to unlearn the endless chorus of her voice in my head, telling me I owed her. One day, while cleaning out an old box, I found a stack of letters she'd written me during those early years when I had first moved out. Demands disguised as love. Lines like, "Remember, you'll never be anything without me," or "Every paycheck you earn is thanks to the roof I gave you." I held them in my hands and realized I no longer felt fear reading them. I didn't even feel the urge to rip them up. I felt nothing. That was the freedom I had fought for. My aunt, meanwhile, had dwindled into the kind of person she used to mock. Isolated, bitter, clinging to old stories no one cared to hear anymore. I never went back, never visited, never answered her last desperate messages. Because in truth, I didn't need a final showdown or an apology she'd never give. The courtroom had given me justice. Time had given me distance, and my own choices had given me peace. Standing in my apartment one evening, light streaming through the windows, I thought about all the years she'd tried to convince me I was nothing without her. And yet here I was, whole, independent, loved by people who valued me for who I was, not what they could take from me. That was the ultimate answer to her claims. Not a dollar sign, not a judgment, but the life I had built in spite of her. As the years kept passing, I saw the distance between us stretch into something permanent, something unfixable. And I realized that was exactly what I needed. My aunt became a cautionary tale in our community, whispered about in church basements and grocery store aisles. People would say things like, "She tried to sue her own niece for money," or "Imagine pocketing a child's benefits and still demanding more." Where once she had played the martyr, now she was the spectacle. I didn't have to lift a finger. Her own choices had written her legacy for her. Meanwhile, my life was blooming in ways she never imagined possible. I moved into a home filled with warmth, not fear. I hosted friends for dinners where laughter echoed in the rooms instead of her endless criticism. I pursued a career that gave me stability. And in time, I found love that was built on respect instead of control. Therapy helped me unlearn the lies she drilled into me. That I was indebted, that I was unworthy, that my existence was a burden. I began to believe the opposite, that I was strong, deserving, and more than enough. One evening, as I sat with a glass of wine on my balcony, watching the city lights shimmer below, I thought about that moment in the courtroom when the judge declared, "You don't owe her anything." Those words had freed me more than I realized at the time. They had been the key turning in the lock, opening a life she never wanted me to have. And the truth was, she could never touch me again. Not legally, not emotionally, not spiritually. She had lost, not just in court, but in life. And the sweetest part was knowing she had done it to herself. I still remember the last time her name was mentioned to me. A former neighbor reached out, someone who had seen both sides of her performance, the saintly mask she wore in public, and the cruelty behind closed doors. They told me she had grown bitterer, lonelier, often sitting on her porch, muttering about how ungrateful I was. I listened quietly, thanked them for telling me, and hung up. And that was it. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't even feel satisfaction. I felt nothing, and that nothing was freedom, because she no longer lived rent-free in my head, no longer controlled the way I saw myself. She was just another person in the world who made her choices and faced their consequences. It struck me then how much power I had gained by refusing to engage. She had always wanted me to fight, to come crawling back, to beg for her approval or forgiveness. Instead, I built a life that didn't include her at all. And in doing so, I finally understood that revenge doesn't always look like fire and fury. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like walking away and never turning back. She wanted me to believe I owed her $50,000. What she could never comprehend was that she owed me something far greater. A childhood, a safe home, a chance to grow without fear. Those debts can never be repaid, but I no longer carry them. I set them down and walked forward, lighter, stronger, untouchable. There was a time when I thought the scars she left on me would define me forever. The nights I cried myself to sleep on that basement cot. The mornings I scrubbed her kitchen floor before school. The endless shame of being told I was a burden she carried out of duty. But the farther I moved from her orbit, the clearer it became that those scars weren't chains. They were proof I had survived, and survival gave me a perspective she would never have. I began speaking more openly about what I went through, not just at that community event, but in smaller, more intimate ways. With co-workers who wondered how I stayed so calm under pressure. With friends who confided about their own toxic families. With young people who feared they'd never escape the grip of manipulative relatives. Every time I shared a piece of my story, I felt stronger, because I was no longer protecting her image with my silence. She had built her power on secrets, and I had dismantled that power simply by telling the truth. Sometimes people ask me if I hated her, if I wished her dead, if I lay awake at night plotting ways to get even. And my answer was always the same: no, because true revenge isn't in hating someone. It's in refusing to let them matter anymore. I didn't hate her. I pitied her. I pitied the emptiness that drove her to demand money she didn't deserve, to cling to lies when the truth was already known, to alienate everyone who might have loved her if she'd been capable of love herself. She once told me I'd never be anything without her. But now, looking at the life I built, the career, the friendships, the love, the peace, I knew the exact opposite was true. I became everything in spite of her. The turning point came when I realized I no longer flinched at the sound of her name. For so many years, just hearing your aunt would make my stomach knot and my pulse quicken, like I was about to be dragged back into that cold basement or back into court. But one afternoon, a co-worker mentioned they thought they'd seen her at a bus stop across town, and instead of panic, all I felt was distance. She wasn't the monster in my story anymore. She was just an aging woman sitting alone, her bitterness her only companion. That was when I knew the story was finally mine again. I had taken back every piece she tried to control. I didn't owe her money. I didn't owe her silence. I didn't owe her the rest of my life spent in chains she forged. All I owed myself was peace, and I had earned it. Sometimes at night, I would sit by my window and think about that courtroom moment when the judge told her flatly, "This claim is outrageous." In those 4 words, everything I had carried for decades was lifted. She couldn't twist the narrative anymore. The truth was written in court records, in the binders of evidence, in the eyes of everyone who saw her crumble under the weight of her own lies. And while she faded into obscurity, I found myself stepping into the kind of future she never imagined I could have. One where my success wasn't a debt to anyone, but a victory all my own. I remember the first time I stood in my own home, the kind I had always dreamed of as a child, but never dared to believe I'd have. Warm light filled the rooms, books lined the shelves, a kitchen that smelled like fresh bread instead of mildew. I stood there barefoot, sipping tea, and I thought of that basement cot where I once prayed just to feel safe. The contrast nearly made me cry. Not because I was sad, but because I realized how far I had climbed. My aunt used to sneer that I'd never get anywhere without her. But here I was, surrounded not by chains of debt, but by the life I had built from nothing, with no handouts, no manipulation, no stolen checks. Everything was mine. She tried to take my identity too, weaving lies about me into conversations with relatives, claiming I was unstable, ungrateful, even dangerous. But time had peeled those lies apart. People saw me for who I was. Not the caricature she invented, but a woman who endured, who kept receipts, who fought back without screaming, who walked away without looking back. That strength was louder than her smear campaigns ever could be. And though I never sought revenge in the flashy, dramatic sense, I realized I had still won. My revenge was in the silence that filled her phone when her calls went unanswered. It was in the gatherings where her name was only spoken with pity. It was in the steady rhythm of my life. Bills paid on time, a safe bed to sleep in, love and laughter in abundance. She once tried to put a price tag on what she claimed I owed, but the truth was priceless. Freedom, dignity, and the kind of peace that no money could buy. And in that, she was left with nothing, while I had everything she tried to keep from me. There came a day when I was walking through the park, the air crisp, families gathered on blankets, children laughing in the distance, and I caught myself smiling for no reason at all. It hit me that this was the life I had always wanted, simple and unburdened. No one looming over me with accusations, no one demanding payment for love they never gave. My aunt had spent years trying to convince me that I was trapped in her shadow, that I could never stand without her. But in truth, she was the one who crumbled without me. Every time I chose not to answer her calls, every time I stayed silent when she raged, I pulled another thread from the fabric of control she had woven, and eventually there was nothing left. She had tried to turn me into her debtor, her servant, her scapegoat. Instead, she became a ghost in my story, a reminder of what I had overcome. I had carried the weight of her cruelty for so long that I almost didn't recognize the lightness of living without it. But sitting there in that park, the sun warming my face, I realized that was the truest form of justice. Not watching her fall, but watching myself rise. Because while she had spent her life clinging to bitterness, I had learned to let go. While she was left with an empty house and a reputation in ruins, I was surrounded by people who loved me for who I was, not what I could provide. And in that moment, I finally understood. I didn't need her apology. I didn't need her acknowledgement. I didn't need her at all. My freedom was my closure. The final piece of this story isn't about her at all. It's about me stepping fully into the life she swore I'd never have. I remember walking across the stage at my graduation, my name echoing through the auditorium, and thinking how she never once showed up to a single school event, never clapped for me, never encouraged me, and yet there I was, standing tall in a cap and gown, cheered on by friends I had chosen as family. Later, when I got my first promotion at work, I celebrated with colleagues who respected me for my hard work, not because they felt entitled to what I earned, but because they truly believed I deserved it. That was when I realized my life had split into two timelines. The one where she tried to keep me trapped in her web, and the one I had built beyond it. I chose the second, and it made all the difference. Over time, I stopped hearing updates about her altogether. Whether she was still in that smaller house, whether she was still trying to guilt her children, whether she still muttered my name under her breath, it didn't matter anymore. She was no longer a character in my story. She was a closed chapter. My revenge wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't about seeing her punished or humiliated. It was in reclaiming my power, my voice, my peace. It was in walking into every room, knowing I was no one's debtor, no one's pawn, no one's burden. The judge's words stayed with me all these years. You don't owe her anything. At the time, it was a verdict. But now, it's a truth I live by every single day. And maybe that's the irony. She wanted me to believe I owed her $50,000. But in the end, she owed me something far greater. The proof that I could rise without her, thrive without her, and live a life so full and so free that she couldn't touch it. Not with her lies, not with her bitterness, not with all the courts in the world. Years later, I sometimes catch myself thinking about how different my life would have been if I had believed her lies, if I had accepted the false debt she tried to chain me to. I might have spent my adulthood sending her money I didn't have, apologizing for things I never did, shrinking smaller and smaller to fit into the version of me she demanded. But instead, I chose the harder path, to fight, to gather evidence, to sit in that courtroom and face her down. And because of that choice, everything changed. I built a career that gave me not just financial stability, but pride. I traveled to places I once only saw in books, standing in front of landmarks with tears in my eyes, because I had made it there on my own. I found love that wasn't conditional, friendships that weren't transactional, and a sense of home that wasn't tied to fear. And through it all, the lesson became crystal clear. Family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by how people treat you. She may have shared DNA with me, but she never shared love. My revenge wasn't in watching her collapse under her own lies, though that happened. It was in refusing to let those lies define me. I was no longer the girl in the basement, the child silenced into believing she was a burden. I was a woman who had taken every broken piece and built a future out of it. And while my aunt faded into the background, forgotten and bitter, I stepped fully into the life she swore I would never have. That was my justice. That was my closure. When I look back now, it almost feels like two different lives. The one where I was trapped under her roof, and the one I built after stepping out of it for good. I can still smell the damp basement where she made me sleep, still hear her footsteps above me as if I was something less than family, something less than human. She wanted me to carry those memories like shackles forever, reminders of the debt she claimed I owed. But instead, I turned them into fuel. Every insult became a reason to prove her wrong. Every unpaid medical bill, every stolen welfare check, every slammed door in my face. I carried them not as chains, but as stepping stones, leading me forward. The courtroom was the turning point. Yes, but the real victory came after, in the quiet, steady reclaiming of my own life. I remember moving into my first real home and setting up the bedroom just the way I wanted, with warm colors, soft blankets, and a lock on the door that only I controlled. It was such a small thing, but to me, it was everything. For the first time, I felt safe. For the first time, I could close my eyes and know that no one could barge in and take what was mine. That sense of safety grew into confidence, and that confidence grew into freedom. I didn't just survive her, I outgrew her. She spent years insisting I was nothing without her, but the truth was, she was nothing without the control she had over me. Over time, I stopped flinching at her name. I stopped wondering if she would show up again with new accusations. Stopped checking my phone for her messages. Stopped caring what story she told about me to others. Her voice had been the loudest in my head for so long, but now it was drowned out by laughter, by friendships, by the sound of my own joy. And the irony, the more I lived, the smaller she became. While she withered in her bitterness, I thrived in the life she swore I'd never have. She wanted repayment. What she gave me instead was resilience. She wanted submission. What she taught me instead was defiance. She wanted to break me. What she did instead was forge me. The judge's words that day still echo whenever I need them. You don't owe her anything. At first, they freed me from her, but now they've come to mean something bigger. I don't owe anyone my silence, my obedience, or my soul. I owe myself happiness, peace, and the right to live without shame. That is what I've chosen. And if she still sits somewhere muttering my name, clinging to the fantasy that I destroyed her life, let her. Because the truth is, she destroyed herself. And I I built a life she can never touch. So in the end, her demand for $50,000 gave me something priceless. The realization that I don't owe her, or anyone like her, a single thing. My freedom, my peace, my life, they're mine. That is the final verdict. That is my revenge.